Rain slammed against the concrete like gunfire as two military helicopters tore through the night sky, their rotors screaming loud enough to rattle windows 6 floors below. Floodlights snapped on. Nurses froze mid-step. Doctors stared upward, hearts pounding as armed figures jumped down onto the hospital helipad with terrifying urgency. "Where is she?" one of them shouted, voice cutting through the storm. "Where is Emily Carter?" No one answered. Minutes earlier, she had stood right here, soaked, shaking, humiliated, her hospital badge stripped from her chest and tossed aside like trash. No goodbye, no defense, just silence, rain, and a door closing behind her. Now the same hospital that fired her was being locked down by forces no one dared question. Phones buzzed. Administrators turned pale. Someone whispered, "What did we do?" Because whatever they thought Emily Carter was, they were wrong. And the truth was descending fast. Before the story continues, take a second to tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your city. And if you enjoy intense emotional stories like this, consider subscribing. You won't want to miss what happens next. Emily Carter had learned long ago how to make herself small without becoming weak. She moved through Mercy General Hospital, the way a shadow moves along a wall, present useful, rarely noticed unless something went wrong. At 5 feet 6 inches with dark hair, always pulled into a tight bun, and scrubs that were perpetually a shade, too faded from too many washes, she didn't look like someone who demanded attention. She didn't raise her voice in meetings. She didn't trade gossip at the nurses' station. She didn't complain when she pulled double shifts or covered for colleagues who just couldn't tonight. Most people at Mercy General thought of her as reliable. That was the word they used. Not brilliant, not exceptional, just reliable. Patients, however, used different words. They said she listened, that she noticed when pain meds wore off 10 minutes too early, that she caught subtle changes in breathing patterns before monitors started screaming. Families remembered the way she explained things calmly, without false hope or cruelty, even at 3 in the morning when exhaustion made everyone else short-tempered. Emily never corrected anyone who underestimated her. She had learned that being overlooked came with a certain kind of freedom. On this particular evening, the ER was already drowning. The digital board above the charge nurse's desk glowed red with delays. Ambulances were backed up outside their engines, idling like restless animals. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic sweat and the metallic tang of fear that clung to trauma centers when too many lives were hanging in balance at once. Emily checked her watch 1942 hours, then glanced at the triage notes on her tablet. 3 criticals inbound, 1 pediatric, 1 cardiac arrest. 1 unidentified male pulled from a highway pileup 10 miles east. She inhaled slowly and squared her shoulders. "Room 4 is ready," she said quietly, passing the charge nurse. "We'll need blood warmed and respiratory on standby." The charge nurse nodded without really looking at her. "Dr. Wallace is lead tonight," she said, as if that explained everything. Emily already knew. Dr. Nathan Wallace had been at Mercy General for nearly 20 years. Board certified, well connected, the kind of physician administration trusted instinctively, even when his instincts leaned more toward authority than accuracy. He had a reputation for brilliance, and an equally strong reputation for not liking to be questioned, especially by nurses, especially by women who didn't match his idea of what competence looked like. Emily didn't dislike Dr. Wallace. Dislike took emotional energy she couldn't spare. She simply observed him the way she observed everything else, carefully, quietly, without illusion. The first ambulance arrived with sirens screaming. Chaos followed. Emily moved on. Autopilot gloves snapped on vitals, called out IV lines, secured with efficient precision. Her hands were steady. Her voice stayed level even when the trauma bay erupted with overlapping commands and alarms. BPs dropping, a resident shouted. 80 systolic, someone echoed. "Doctor." Wallace stepped in, already barking orders. "Push fluids. Prep for intubation. We're losing him." Emily leaned closer to the patient, her eyes tracking the subtle rise and fall of his chest. Something didn't sit right. The monitor showed what it showed, but the body told a slightly different story. She noticed the asymmetry in chest expansion, the faint distension at the neck veins, the way the patient's oxygen saturation dipped not in sharp drops but in uneven waves. Her mind connected dots she didn't consciously name. "Doctor," she said, just loud enough to be heard, "we should consider a tension pneumothorax." Dr. Wallace didn't even turn toward her. "Negative," he snapped. "Chest X-ray first." Emily hesitated for half a second. Time stretched in that narrow space between obedience and responsibility. "The X-ray will take too long," she said. "He's crashing." "We need—" I said. "No, doctor." Wallace cut in, finally facing her. His eyes were sharp, irritated. "Stick to your role." The room went quiet in the way it always did when hierarchy asserted itself. A few nurses exchanged glances. No one else spoke. Emily felt the familiar pressure behind her ribs, the one that came when she saw a preventable outcome lining up like dominoes. She looked at the patient again, looked at the clock, looked at the rising panic in the resident's eyes. She made a decision. "Needle decompression tray," she said, reaching for supplies. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't shake. It carried authority born not from position but from certainty. Dr. Wallace spun on her. "Emily, stop." She didn't. The needle slid in cleanly. A rush of trapped air escaped with an audible hiss. The patient's chest rose more evenly. The monitor stabilized just enough to buy them time. For 3 long seconds, no one spoke. Then the room exhaled. Vitals improved. Oxygen saturation climbed. The resident stared at the monitor in disbelief. Dr. Wallace's face darkened, not with relief, but with something colder. "Get out," he said quietly. Emily looked up. "The patient, I'll handle it," he said. "You're done here." She stepped back without argument. Someone else took her place. The trauma bay swallowed the moment and moved on as it always did. But Dr. Wallace didn't forget. Neither did the cameras mounted silently in the corners of the ceiling. An hour later, when the rush slowed just enough for consequences to catch up, Emily was called upstairs. Human Resources occupied a carpeted wing far removed from the noise and blood of the ER. The air was cooler there, quieter. The walls were lined with framed mission statements about compassion and teamwork. Emily sat alone in a chair that was deliberately too low, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Across from her, an HR representative flipped through printed reports while Dr. Wallace stood by the window, arms crossed. No one asked Emily for her version of events. The words came dressed in professionalism, protocol, deviation, chain of command, liability, exposure. But the message underneath was clear. She had embarrassed the wrong person. Effective immediately, the HR rep said, sliding a document across the desk. "Your employment with Mercy General is terminated." Emily stared at the paper. She felt no anger, no shock. Only a deep, steady sadness, not for herself, but for how easily truth was bent when ego demanded it. When she stood and unclipped her badge, the plastic felt heavier than it should have. Outside rain hammered the hospital doors as she stepped into the night, unaware that somewhere far beyond the city alarms had already begun to sound, and that her name had just been spoken into a secure line with unmistakable urgency. The rain had not let up. It sheeted down in thick, relentless curtains, blurring the glass facade of Mercy General Hospital and turning the parking lot into a mirror of broken lights. Emily Carter stood just beyond the automatic doors for a moment longer than necessary, feeling the cold soak through her scrubs, grounding her in the reality she hadn't quite named yet. She was no longer staff. Behind her, the doors slid shut with a soft, mechanical sigh. The sound felt final in a way words hadn't. Emily adjusted the strap of her worn backpack on one shoulder and stepped forward into the storm. Her shoes splashed through shallow puddles as she crossed the lot, head bowed, shoulders squared, not hunched. She didn't run. She didn't look back. Inside the hospital, life continued as if nothing irreversible had just happened. Dr. Wallace strode down the corridor with purpose, white coat snapping behind him like a banner. A few nurses watched him pass, their expressions unreadable. No one stopped him. No one challenged the story he was already telling himself, that discipline had been restored, that order had been maintained. In Trauma Bay 2, the patient Emily had intervened on, lay sedated but alive. A ventilator hissed rhythmically. The resident hovered nearby, replaying the moment again and again in his head. "She was right," he murmured to no one in particular. A senior nurse shot him a warning look. "Careful," she said quietly. "This isn't a hill you want to die on." The resident swallowed and nodded the lesson, sinking in with bitter clarity. Up on the administrative floor, an email was being drafted. Subject line, incident review. nursing conduct. It would be circulated. It would be archived. It would become the official version of events. No one mentioned that Emily Carter had saved a life. Emily reached her car, an aging sedan parked beneath a flickering light. She unlocked it, climbed inside, and sat there with the engine off, listening to the rain drum against the roof. For the first time since HR's office, her hands trembled. She pressed her palms against the steering wheel until the shaking subsided, breathed in through her nose, out through her mouth, slow, controlled. The way she'd been taught long before Mercy General ever existed in her life. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't look at it right away. When she did, the screen showed a number with no name attached, just a sequence of digits she hadn't seen in years. Emily closed her eyes. So it had begun. She answered on the second ring. "This is Carter." The voice on the other end was calm, clipped, unmistakably professional. "Emily, we need to verify your status. Go ahead. Are you currently employed at Mercy General Hospital?" There it was. "No," she said. "As of 40 minutes ago." A pause. Not surprise, calculation. "Where are you now?" "In the parking lot," she replied. "About to leave. Stay where you are." Emily glanced up at the hospital looming ahead, its windows glowing warmly against the dark sky. "I was told very clearly to go," she said. "You're not being asked by the hospital," the voice replied. "This is a federal request." She exhaled slowly. "Understood." The line went dead. Emily placed the phone face down on the passenger seat and stared ahead through the rain-streaked windshield. She felt the old weight settle back onto her shoulders, not fear but responsibility, the kind that never truly left once it had found you. She had hoped those days were behind her. Inside, Mercy General Dr. Wallace convened a brief meeting with administration. He spoke with confidence, framing the incident as a necessary correction. Words like risk mitigation and command integrity floated easily from his mouth. The hospital director nodded along. "We can't have staff making unilateral decisions," she said. "It undermines the entire system." "Exactly," Wallace agreed. "If we let that slide, we invite chaos." No one asked whether the system had worked. No one noticed the faint tremor in the building, a vibration too low to register as sound, but real nonetheless. Down on the rooftop helipad, the wind shifted. Security cameras swiveled automatically, tracking movement that hadn't yet appeared. The red beacon lights pulsed steadily, cutting through the rain. In the security office, a guard frowned at his monitors. "That's odd," he muttered, leaning closer. "We're getting airspace alerts." His colleague shrugged. "Probably medevac rerouting. Storm's bad tonight." But the alerts kept coming. Restricted airspace. Priority clearance. Military designation codes that almost never appeared on civilian systems. "What the hell?" the guard whispered. Back in her car, Emily felt it before she heard it. A low-frequency thrum rolled through the air, subtle at first, like distant thunder. She stiffened her gaze, snapping upward instinctively, tracking the sound through layers of rain and cloud. The vibration grew stronger. She started the engine, then stopped herself. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message. "Do not leave. Assets inbound." Emily let out a humorless breath. "Of course, they are," she murmured. Inside the ER, a nurse glanced toward the ceiling as a faint tremor rattled a supply cart. "Did you feel that?" Another nurse frowned. "Yeah. What was that, doctor?" Wallace paused mid-sentence as a dull roar began to seep through the walls. He frowned, irritation flickering across his face. "That's not thunder," someone said quietly. The roar deepened, unmistakable now. "Rotors." The building seemed to hold its breath. On the helipad, rain whipped sideways as twin shapes emerged from the clouds, descending fast, purposeful, unstoppable. And somewhere between the parking lot and the locked glass doors of Mercy General Emily Carter stepped out of her car, lifted her face to the storm, and prepared herself for the consequences she knew were coming. By the time the first helicopter's shadow swept across the parking lot, Mercy General Hospital was already unraveling from the inside. Security doors that rarely saw use slid shut with metallic finality, sealing off stairwells and corridors. Elevators halted mid-descent. A calm but unmistakably strained voice echoed over the PA system, announcing a temporary lockdown due to external operational activity. No further explanation followed. Confusion spread faster than fear. In the ER, nurses clustered around the central desk, whispering urgently. Monitors beeped. A trauma pager chirped unanswered on the counter. Someone had turned the television in the waiting area to a local news channel, where a weather reporter stood grim-faced in front of a radar map pulsing with red and yellow. None of them mentioned helicopters. Dr. Nathan Wallace stood near the nurse's station, arms crossed, jaw tight. He told himself this was coincidence. Military flights passed over the city all the time. Training exercises, emergency transports. Nothing to do with him. Nothing to do with Emily Carter. Still, he couldn't shake the prickle at the base of his neck. "Doctor," the hospital director said, approaching him. Her heels clicked sharply against the tile, a sound that usually signaled control. Tonight, it sounded brittle. "Security says we've got 2 unidentified military aircraft requesting rooftop clearance." Wallace scoffed softly. "Unidentified. That's not how this works." "They're not asking," she replied. "They're informing." Before Wallace could respond, the overhead lights flickered. Just once, but it was enough. On the rooftop, the helipad crew scrambled rain, plastering their jackets to their bodies. The wind howled as the first helicopter descended its landing skids, touching down with bone-jarring force. The second followed seconds later, rotors overlapping in a deafening mechanical roar. Doors slid open. Figures in dark tactical gear moved with precision boots, striking the wet surface in synchronized rhythm. Their faces were obscured by helmets and visors, but their posture radiated purpose. One of them raised a hand, signaling to the pilot. The rotors began to slow, though the thunder of them still vibrated through the building below. Inside the stairwell leading up to the roof, hospital security hesitated. "Do we stop them?" one guard asked, his voice barely audible over the noise. The senior guard stared at the insignia on the lead officer's shoulder through the reinforced glass. His face drained of color. "No," he said quietly. "We do not." The door opened. Down in the parking lot, Emily stood under the flickering streetlight, rain dripping from her hair and soaking her clothes until they clung uncomfortably to her skin. She didn't move toward the hospital. She didn't move away from it either. She simply waited. Her phone vibrated again. This time she answered immediately. "They're on the roof," the voice said. "I know. You shouldn't be exposed like this." Emily glanced around the empty lot. "I've been exposed before." Another pause. This one heavier. "Emily," the voice continued, softer now. "They should never have fired you." "That's not the issue," she replied. "What's the situation?" A sigh barely audible. "We have a confirmation cascade. The decision you made in Trauma Bay. 2, your assessment was correct. The patient's condition triggered a secondary alert tied to a classified protocol." Emily closed her eyes. "So, it's active?" "Yes." She nodded once. "Then we're already late." Inside the hospital, the lead tactical officer stepped off the elevator onto the administrative floor, flanked by 2 others. Their presence sucked the air out of the corridor. Conversations died mid-sentence. Phones were lowered. A woman in a lab coat froze halfway through, pouring coffee. "Who's in charge here?" the officer asked. No one answered. He scanned the group, his gaze settling on the hospital director. "Ma'am, we need Emily Carter. Now." The director swallowed. "She was let go earlier this evening." Silence followed, not the awkward kind, but the kind that carried weight. The officer tilted his head slightly. "Explain." "She violated protocol, Doctor," Wallace said, stepping forward. His voice sounded louder than he intended. Defensive. "She acted outside her scope." The officer turned to him slowly. "Did she?" Wallace straightened. "Yes. She countermanded my orders during a critical procedure." "And the patient stabilized," Wallace admitted. "But that's not the point." The officer's gaze hardened. "It is very much the point." He tapped the side of his helmet. "Command, confirm subject status." A voice crackled through his earpiece. "Confirmed. Emily Carter, former lieutenant colonel. Medical operations. Emergency response division. Clearance level active." The corridor went deathly quiet. The hospital director's eyes widened. "Lieutenant, Colonel, Doctor." Wallace laughed, once sharp and disbelieving. "That's impossible." The officer ignored him. "Where did she go?" another administrator stammered. She left. Out the front." The officer turned on his heel. Lockdown stays in place. No one leaves. We're retrieving her. As the tactical team moved toward the stairs, Dr. Wallace felt something inside him crack, not fear yet, but the sudden realization that the narrative he'd constructed was collapsing. Downstairs, the automatic doors slid open again as Emily stepped inside rainwater pooling at her feet. Conversations halted. Heads turned. She looked exactly as she had an hour ago, tired, soaked, unremarkable. Except now every eye followed her. She took 3 steps forward before a voice boomed from behind her. Emily Carter. She stopped. Slowly she turned. The lead officer stood framed in the doorway, helmet under his arm, rain dripping from his gear. He met her gaze and gave a crisp nod. "Ma'am," he said, "we've been looking for you." The hospital seemed to shrink around them. Emily glanced past him at the stunned faces of doctors and administrators at Dr. Wallace, pale and rigid at the director, clutching her tablet like a shield. Then she looked back at the officer. "I was fired," she said calmly. "I don't work here anymore." The officer's jaw tightened. "That," he replied, "is about to be corrected." The words hung in the air like a challenge no one dared to answer. "That is about to be corrected." Emily Carter didn't react the way the room expected. She didn't straighten to attention. She didn't ask for explanations. She didn't look vindicated. She simply stood there, rain dripping from the hem of her scrubs onto the polished hospital floor, and studied the officer in front of her, as if weighing a familiar equation. "Before we go any further," she said evenly, "you need to understand something." The officer nodded once. "Understood, ma'am." "I am not here to make a point," Emily continued. "I'm here because someone is still at risk." A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Dr. Wallace scoffed despite himself. "This is absurd," he snapped. "She's manipulating the situation. Whatever background she claims to have," the officer cut him off without even turning around. "Doctor, you are not part of this conversation." That single sentence carried more authority than Wallace had wielded all evening. The hospital director stepped forward, her voice trembling beneath layers of professional composure. "If there's been a misunderstanding, we're more than willing to review the termination decision. Privately." "Too late," Emily said quietly. The director froze. "Excuse me," Emily finally turned to face her fully. Her expression wasn't angry. It wasn't smug. It was tired in the way of someone who had seen this exact pattern repeat itself under different names in different buildings with different stakes. "You didn't fire me because I was wrong," Emily said. "You fired me because I didn't stay silent." The director opened her mouth, then closed it again. "Emily," the officer said, lowering his voice, "we need you upstairs. Now." She nodded. "I know." As they moved toward the elevator bank, hospital security fell into step behind them, unsure whether they were escorting or being escorted. The doors slid shut with a soft chime, sealing Emily and the tactical team inside. No one spoke as the elevator ascended. The hum of cables filled the silence. Emily stared straight ahead, her reflection faint in the brushed metal doors. In it, she saw not the nurse Mercy General thought they understood, but fragments of other versions of herself layered beneath field hospitals under canvas tents, fluorescent-lit command rooms, stretchers rolling across tarmacs under floodlights. She pushed the memories down. When the doors opened onto the helipad level, the wind hit them like a wall. Rain lashed sideways, stinging exposed skin. The helicopters loomed behind the team, their bulk dark against the flashing red lights. Crew members worked efficiently, heads down, hands sure despite the storm. Emily stepped out into it without hesitation. The officer gestured toward the nearest aircraft. "Command wants you airborne within 5 minutes." "Then they're not accounting for the patient downstairs," she replied. He hesitated. "Ma'am." "The man in Trauma Bay 2, Emily said. "The one you're all reacting to, he hasn't stabilized yet." "Not really." The officer frowned. "Our reports indicate. Your reports are incomplete," she said. "He needs a secondary intervention within the next hour, or everything I did buys him nothing." Rain streamed down her face, but her eyes were sharp, focused. "You pulled assets for me," she continued. "Fine, but I'm not leaving him behind." The officer studied her for a long moment. Then he tapped his earpiece. "Command change of plan. We're holding position. Subject insists on returning to ER." There was a pause long enough to stretch nerves thin. Then, confirmed. The officer exhaled. "You're still running this, aren't you?" Emily allowed herself the faintest smile. "I never stopped." Back downstairs, the ER was in disarray. Word had spread faster than any official announcement. Nurses whispered in corners. Residents hovered near monitors, pretending to work while stealing glances toward the elevators. Phones buzzed with messages that would never quite capture what it felt like to be there in that moment. When Emily walked back in, flanked by armed personnel, this time the room fell silent. She didn't acknowledge the attention. She went straight to the patient. "Vitals?" she asked. The resident snapped to attention instinctively. BP's fluctuating, oxygen saturations unstable. Emily leaned in her hands, moving with familiar confidence. "Prep for chest tube placement," she said. "We're not out of the woods, Doctor." Wallace watched from the edge of the room, his face a mask of disbelief and growing dread. "You can't just," he began. Emily looked at him then, not with anger, with clarity. "You were right about one thing," she said. "Authority matters." Then she turned back to the patient. "But it only matters if you know how to use it." The procedure went smoothly. The patient's vitals steadied for real this time, the monitors beeping, settling into a rhythm that felt almost merciful. A collective breath released from the room. Emily stripped off her gloves and stepped back. Only then did she turn fully toward Dr. Wallace and the administrators who had gathered behind him. "I want the incident footage," she said. "All of it." The director swallowed. That's internal." The officer stepped forward. "It's now part of a federal review." The director nodded numbly. Emily's gaze swept the room, taking in the faces of nurses who had looked away earlier, of residents who had stayed silent, of staff who had learned the cost of speaking up. "I don't need apologies," Emily said. "I need accountability." Dr. Wallace's composure finally cracked. "You think this makes you untouchable?" he demanded. "You think helicopters erase protocol?" Emily met his stare without flinching. "No," she said. "They expose who hides behind it." Sirens wailed faintly in the distance as rain continued to batter the city. Somewhere above them, rotors idled, waiting, and for the first time since the night began, Mercy General Hospital understood that the storm hadn't arrived from the sky. It had been standing quietly in its halls all along. The storm outside showed no sign of mercy, but inside Mercy General, a different kind of pressure began to build, slower, heavier, inescapable. Emily stood at the foot of the trauma bay bed, arms crossed loosely, watching the monitor settle into a steady rhythm. The patient's chest rose evenly now. Color crept back into his face. For the first time since he'd been wheeled in the room, felt stable. Not safe, just stable. "That buys us time," Emily said. "Not forgiveness." The resident nodded, eyes wide. "We'll keep him under close observation." "Do that," she replied, "and document everything." He hesitated. "Everything." Emily met his gaze, especially the parts that make people uncomfortable. Across the room, Dr. Wallace stood rigid, his arms folded so tightly his knuckles had gone white. He looked smaller somehow, his authority shrinking under the weight of scrutiny he wasn't used to bearing. "This is turning into a spectacle," he said, attempting control through tone alone. "Patients don't benefit from power plays." Emily turned toward him slowly. "You're right," she said. "They don't." The words weren't sharp, but they landed hard. She gestured toward the bed. That man benefited because someone acted when silence would have been easier. That's not a power play. That's medicine. Before Wallace could respond, the hospital director's phone buzzed. She glanced down, then paled. "We have additional personnel inbound," she said quietly. "Federal." The officer beside Emily nodded. "They're already on site." Within minutes, the atmosphere shifted again. Men and women in civilian attire entered the ER. No uniforms, no weapons visible, but their presence carried unmistakable authority. They spoke little. They observed everything. One of them approached Emily, offering a badge briefly for identification. "Special investigations," he said. "We'll need a full account from you, but not yet." Emily inclined her head. "I'm not going anywhere." He studied her for a moment. "We know." The words sent a ripple through the room. Staff exchanged looks. The implication was clear. This wasn't about reinstatement or apologies anymore. This was about systems and failures far larger than one hospital. "Doctor." Wallace felt the walls closing in. He retreated to his office under the pretense of closing the door with more force than necessary. Inside, he paced, replaying the night over and over, searching for the moment where he'd lost control. She had defied him. A nurse, no worse. A nurse who had been right. His phone buzzed. A message from administration asking him to stand by for further review. Review. The word tasted bitter. Back in the ER, Emily leaned against a counter, exhaustion finally seeping into her bones now that the immediate danger had passed. Her clothes were still damp, her hair clung to her face, but she didn't bother fixing it. One of the nurses approached her hesitantly. Emily. She looked up. "Yes, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry," the nurse said, "for not backing you earlier." Emily considered her for a long moment. "I don't need sorry," she said gently. "I need you to remember how that felt. Next time." The nurse nodded, tears welling. "I will." The officer returned, his expression unreadable. "Command wants you briefed." Upstairs. Emily straightened. "The patient, he's stable. We have eyes on him." She followed the officer out of the ER past faces that now watched her with a mix of awe and uncertainty. The elevator ride up was silent again, but this time the silence carried a different weight. Not dread, but inevitability. In a secured conference room overlooking the helipad, a dozen people waited. Screens glowed with data. Emily recognized instantly protocol trees, emergency response frameworks, decision matrices she had helped design years ago. A woman in a tailored suit stood as Emily entered. "Lieutenant Colonel Carter," she said, extending a hand. "I'm Director Hayes." Emily shook it. "Former," she corrected. Hayes smiled faintly. "Not tonight." They sat. Hayes gestured to the screen. "Your intervention triggered an alert because the patient matched a rare but specific profile tied to a classified preparedness protocol, one that hasn't been activated in years." Emily nodded. "I suspected as much." Which means, Hayes continued, that had you not acted, we might be discussing a very different outcome right now. Emily folded her hands. "Then let's not waste time." Hayes studied her. "You were terminated for acting outside hospital protocol." Emily's expression didn't change. "Hospital protocol isn't designed for black swan events." "No," Hayes agreed. "It's designed for liability." A beat passed. "We're initiating a full review of Mercy General's emergency response policies," Hayes said, "and its leadership." Emily glanced toward the window where the helicopters sat like patient predators. "That won't be popular." "No," Hayes said, "but it will be necessary." Downstairs, Dr. Wallace was escorted from his office. Not arrested. Not yet. But the way security stood on either side of him, firm, impersonal, told him everything he needed to know. As he passed the nurse's station, he caught sight of Emily through the glass wall of the conference room above. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the city beyond the storm. And for the first time, he understood something that terrified him. She had never been trying to win. She had been trying to prevent exactly this kind of failure. The rain began to ease just slightly, the storm losing its edge as dawn crept closer. But inside Mercy General Hospital, the reckoning was only beginning. By the time dawn began to thin the darkness at the edges of the sky, Mercy General no longer felt like a hospital. It felt like a facility under audit. Corridors that once buzzed with routine urgency were now hushed footsteps, measured voices lowered. Staff badges were checked more often than usual. Security personnel, some familiar, some unmistakably not, stood at intersections where no one had ever stood before. Emily Carter noticed all of it. She sat alone in the conference room, a paper cup of coffee cooling untouched beside her. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the storm clouds were breaking apart, revealing streaks of pale gray light. One of the helicopters had powered down completely. The other idled rotors ticking as they slowed like a held breath finally released. Director Hayes re-entered the room with a tablet in hand. "They've started pulling records," she said without preamble. "Incident footage, staffing logs, prior complaints." Emily nodded. "How far back?" 5 years. Possibly more. "That should be enough," Emily replied. Hayes studied her. "You're very calm for someone who was fired and publicly humiliated less than 6 hours ago." Emily's lips curved, just barely. "I've been calm in worse places." Hayes accepted that without pressing. Downstairs, the ER attempted to return to normal, but the weight of what had happened refused to lift. Nurses moved carefully, documenting every decision with unusual thoroughness. Residents double-checked orders. Conversations carried an edge of caution. The patient from Trauma Bay 2 remained stable. Word of that spread quickly, and with it a quiet truth no one could quite suppress. Emily Carter had been right. Doctor. Wallace sat in a small administrative office under supervision, his phone confiscated, his white coat folded neatly on the desk, like a relic from another life. He replayed the evening over and over, searching for a version where he had handled it differently. There wasn't one that ended well. A knock sounded. A man in a dark suit entered, expression neutral. "Dr. Wallace," he said. "We'll need a formal statement." Wallace straightened. "On what grounds?" "On your decision-making during a critical care event," the man replied. "And your role in the subsequent termination of Emily Carter." Wallace bristled. "She disobeyed a direct order and saved a life," the man countered. "Those two facts are not mutually exclusive." Wallace fell silent. Back upstairs, Emily finally allowed herself to sip the coffee. It tasted burnt and thin, but the warmth helped. She glanced at the clock on the wall, 0538. Almost morning. Hayes leaned against the table. "There's something else," she said. "Your employment status." Emily raised an eyebrow. "I wondered how long it would take." "We can reinstate you immediately," Hayes said. "With protections, oversight, whatever terms you want." Emily considered that. She thought of the HR office, the low chair, the badge sliding across the desk, the way the rain had felt on her skin as the doors closed behind her. "No," she said. Hayes blinked. "No, I won't go back like nothing happened," Emily replied. "That would teach the wrong lesson." Hayes nodded slowly. "What would teach the right one?" Emily set the cup down. "Transparency, policy reform, mandatory review of chain of command override procedures, and independent reporting protections for nurses. That's ambitious." Emily met her gaze. So was landing 2 helicopters on a civilian hospital roof. A beat passed. Then Hayes smiled, genuine this time. "I'll take it to command," she said. The sun finally broke free of the clouds, casting a pale gold light over the helipad. Below, staff gathered near windows, watching as personnel began packing equipment, rolling cases back toward the aircraft. Someone whispered, "It's over." Emily knew better. In the ER, the resident who had assisted her earlier found himself staring at the trauma bay doors. He replayed her calm voice in his head, the way she had spoken up without hesitation. When the charge nurse passed, he stopped her. "If something like that happens again," he said quietly, "I won't stay silent." She studied him, then nodded once. "Good." Word reached the waiting room that the lockdown would be lifted soon. Families stirred hopeful. Life, stubborn and relentless, pressed forward. Upstairs, Hayes returned with her tablet. "Command approved your conditions," she said. "And there's more." Emily waited. "They want you to stay on," Hayes continued. "Not as staff, as oversight. Interim." Emily exhaled slowly. "You're asking me to hold a mirror up to this place?" "Yes. And you understand not everyone will like what they see." Hayes didn't hesitate. "That's the point." For the first time that night, Emily felt something loosen in her chest. "Then I'll stay," she said. "On one condition. Name it." "No more quiet firings," Emily said. "If someone is punished for speaking up, it happens in the light." Hayes nodded. "Agreed." Down the hall, Dr. Wallace was escorted past the conference room one last time. Through the glass, he saw Emily seated at the table, calm, composed, very much in control. Their eyes met. For a fleeting moment, Wallace opened his mouth as if to speak, to justify, to defend himself. Emily looked away. The doors closed behind him. As the helicopters lifted off one by one, the roar faded into the distance, replaced by the ordinary sounds of a hospital waking up to a new day. But nothing at Mercy General was ordinary anymore, and Emily Carter knew the hardest part was still ahead. Morning rounds began with a tension no chart could record. The sun was fully up now, pouring through Mercy General's glass facade, but the light did nothing to warm the atmosphere. Conversations stopped when Emily passed, not out of fear, out of uncertainty. The staff didn't know who she was anymore, and that frightened them more than authority ever could. She walked the corridors slowly, hands clasped behind her back, accompanied by Director Hayes and a quiet man from Special Investigations who never introduced himself twice. Every few steps, Emily paused, not to inspect equipment, but to observe behavior. She watched how nurses deferred, how residents hesitated before speaking, how supervisors stood just a little straighter when policies were mentioned. Systems always revealed themselves under stress. "Your presence alone is already changing things," Hayes said quietly. Emily didn't respond right away. She stopped outside a glass-walled conference room where two administrators were speaking in hushed tones. When they noticed her, they fell silent instantly. "That's not change," Emily said at last. "That's fear." Hayes frowned. "Isn't that inevitable?" "No," Emily replied. "Fear makes people hide mistakes. Accountability makes them surface." They continued down the hall. Inside the ER, the night shift was handing off to day staff. The patient from Trauma Bay 2 remained stable, but Emily noticed something else. Immediately, a subtle but dangerous pattern forming. A nurse hesitated before questioning a medication dosage. A resident glanced toward the nurse's station before answering a family's question, as if checking whether it was safe to speak freely. Emily stepped in. "Why the delay?" she asked the nurse gently. The nurse swallowed. "I just wanted to double-check before good," Emily said. "That's exactly what you should do." The nurse blinked, surprised. Emily turned to the resident. "And you," she said. "If you don't know the answer, say so. Uncertainty isn't weakness." The resident nodded, relief flickering across his face. Across the room, a senior attending watched the exchange with thinly veiled irritation. "This isn't how we usually run things," he said. Emily met his gaze. "That's why I'm here." By mid-morning, the hospital directorate convened an emergency meeting. 12 people sat around a polished table, each with their own version of the truth, each with something to lose. Emily stood at the head, not seated, not presiding present. "This is not a witch hunt," she began, "but it is a reckoning." A man cleared his throat. "With all due respect, Lieutenant Colonel Emily," she corrected. He nodded stiffly. "Emily, Mercy General has protocols for a reason. Chain of command prevents chaos." Emily leaned forward, palms resting on the table. "Chain of command prevents chaos when it functions," she said. "When it doesn't, it creates it." She tapped the screen behind her. Footage appeared, Trauma Bay 2 time-stamped. "This is the moment," Emily said, where a nurse recognized a life-threatening condition faster than the system allowed, where the system tried to silence her. No one spoke. "You can discipline deviation," she continued, "or you can investigate why deviation was necessary. You cannot do both, honestly." A woman at the far end shifted uncomfortably. "And if we choose wrong," Emily's voice softened, "people die quietly." Silence stretched. Outside the conference room, phones buzzed non-stop. Rumors were already spreading beyond Mercy General. A helicopter landing wasn't something a hospital could hide, and someone had filmed it from 3 blocks away. Social media did the rest. 2 military helicopters stormed City Hospital. Who were they looking for? Why was the hospital locked down? Public Affairs was in damage control mode before lunch. Hayes leaned toward Emily. "We're getting inquiries from State Health Oversight," she whispered. "And the press." Emily nodded. "Good. Good," Hayes echoed. "Sunlight," Emily said. "Remember, down in the administrative holding office, Dr. Wallace sat alone, staring at the wall. His statement had been taken. His credentials were under review. He had called his lawyer twice already. The door opened. He looked up, expecting security. It was Emily. For a moment, neither spoke. "You didn't have to come," Wallace said finally. "I know," Emily replied. She remained standing. "I wanted to." Wallace laughed weakly. "To watch me fall?" "No," she said. "To understand you," he scoffed. "Then you already do." Emily studied him. "You weren't wrong to care about protocol," she said. "You were wrong to confuse it with control." Wallace's jaw tightened. "You think this makes you better?" "No," Emily said. "It makes me responsible." She turned to leave. Emily Wallace said, desperation bleeding through. "If you testify." She paused at the door. "I don't need to," she said. "The footage does that for me." When she left, Wallace slumped back in his chair, finally understanding the true cost of silence. By afternoon, Mercy General buzzed with a new kind of energy. Meetings were postponed. Policies were pulled. Committees were formed. Too many, Emily thought. Committees were where urgency went to die. She stood once more in the ER, watching a nurse calmly challenge a medication order and be thanked for it. That was change. Her phone buzzed. A secure number. Emily stepped aside and answered. Carter. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, clipped. This is Washington. We have a situation. Emily's posture stiffened. Go on. The patient you treated last night wasn't just a trigger, the voice continued. He's a node. Emily's eyes narrowed. A node in what? A pause. Something much bigger than Mercy General. The noise of the ER faded around her. How much time, she asked. Not much, the voice said. And you're the only one who can connect the dots. Emily looked around the ER at the nurses, finding their voices at the system just beginning to heal. She closed her eyes briefly. Then she said, I'm listening. The word node echoed in Emily Carter's mind long after she ended the call. She didn't move at first. Around her, the ER continued its steady rhythm monitors, beeping gurneys, rolling voices calling out vitals. Life, stubborn and ordinary, carried on. But for Emily, the room had narrowed her focus, sharpening the way it always did when disparate pieces began aligning into a pattern she wished she didn't recognize. She stepped into an empty consultation room and closed the door. Node. In the world she'd left years ago, that word never meant something simple. It meant convergence. It meant one point touching many others, sometimes invisibly, sometimes disastrously. Director Hayes joined her moments later, concern etched across her face. You look like someone just changed the rules, she said. Emily didn't sit. They didn't change them, she replied. They just reminded me which game we're in. Hayes folded her arms. Talk to me. The patient from last night, Emily said. He wasn't just a medical emergency. He's connected to something active, something unfinished. Hayes's expression tightened. How unfinished, Emily met her gaze. Enough that Washington called me directly. Silence filled the room. That doesn't happen for routine cases, Hayes said slowly. No, Emily agreed. It happens when people are afraid. Hayes exhaled. Of what Emily turned toward the glass wall where she could see staff moving through the ER. Of what happens when systems fail quietly, she said. And no one notices until it's too late. Hayes rubbed her temples. What do you need? Emily didn't hesitate. Full access to the patient's history, unredacted. And I need the hospital's cooperation without delay. Hayes nodded. You'll have it. As they left the room, they nearly collided with a group of administrators huddled near the nurse's station. Their conversation stopped abruptly when they saw Emily. One of them cleared his throat. We were just discussing communications strategy. Emily raised an eyebrow. Already? The man flushed. There's a lot of attention. Yes, Emily said evenly. There should be. She stepped past them, heading toward the ICU. The patient lay sedated, machines humming softly around him. He looked unremarkable now, a middle-aged man with graying hair and calloused hands, a man who might have passed for a construction worker or long-haul truck driver. Emily studied his face. This is where it always starts, she murmured. With someone no one looks twice at. A nurse approached with a tablet. We pulled everything we could, she said. Medical records, travel, history, employment. Emily scanned the data rapidly. Her jaw tightened. Multiple states, she noted. Short stays, gaps where there shouldn't be. What does that mean? The nurse asked. It means he wasn't traveling for work, Emily replied. He was moving. She handed the tablet back. Has anyone asked him what he does? The nurse hesitated. He was unconscious when he came in, and before that, no one thought to. Emily nodded once. That's the problem. By early afternoon, the atmosphere shifted again, this time unmistakably. 2 black SUVs rolled up to the hospital entrance without sirens or spectacle. Men and women stepped out dressed like civilians, but moving with unmistakable coordination. Security cleared a path without being asked. Staff watched in silence as they entered. One of them, a tall man with close-cropped hair and an expression carved from granite, approached Emily directly. Lieutenant Colonel Carter, he said. Agent Morales, FBI. Emily inclined her head. You're late. Morales allowed himself a thin smile. We had to be sure. Of what that Mercy General was no longer suppressing the truth. Emily glanced toward the administrative offices. That's still in progress. Morales nodded. Then let's not waste time. They moved into a secured conference room. Hayes joined them along with the quiet investigator who never gave his name. Morales placed a folder on the table and slid it forward. Your patient is a logistics contractor, he said. Or he was. His company doesn't officially exist anymore. Emily flipped through the file. Shell companies rarely die, she said. They just molt. Exactly, Morales replied. He was part of a distributed network transport storage timing. Nodes. Emily's finger stopped on a photo. This facility, she said. I recognize it. Morales's eyes sharpened. From where? An exercise, Emily replied. 8 years ago. Disaster response simulation. The scenario was a cascading failure triggered by compromised infrastructure. And Hayes asked, and this man, Emily said, tapping the photo, was listed as a civilian variable. Someone who wouldn't look suspicious. Someone no one would stop. Morales leaned back. We believe the event he was tied to is still coming. The words settled heavily. When Emily asked, Morales hesitated. We don't know. That's why we need him awake. Emily closed the folder. Then you should be thanking me, she said. Because if he'd died last night, you'd still be blind. Morales nodded. That's why we're here. Outside the conference room, Doctor. Wallace was escorted through the hallway for what would be his final meeting with hospital legal counsel. Staff watched as he passed, their expressions unreadable. For the first time, no one looked away. Inside the ICU, the patient stirred. A monitor alarm chirped softly. A nurse leaned in, adjusting settings. Emily, she called. He's coming around. Emily and Morales exchanged a glance. They entered the room together. The man's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first. He coughed weakly, a hand twitching against the sheets. Easy, Emily said calmly, stepping into his line of sight. You're safe. You're in a hospital. His gaze locked onto hers, sharp, assessing, far too alert for someone just waking from sedation. Hospital, he rasped. Figures. Emily's lips pressed together. You made it, she said. Barely. He laughed softly, then winced. Story of my life. Morales stepped forward. We have questions. The man's eyes flicked to him, then back to Emily. You're not the ones I was expecting. Emily leaned closer. Neither were they, she said. That's why you're still breathing. His brow furrowed. You're not just a nurse. No, Emily replied. And you're not just a contractor. The man swallowed pain etched across his face. If I talk, he said, people die. Emily's voice dropped. If you don't, more will. Silence stretched between them. Outside the room, Mercy General held its breath again, this time not because of helicopters or storms, but because something far larger had quietly stepped into its halls. And Emily Carter stood once more at the center of it, not because she sought power, but because she had refused to look away when it mattered most. The man's breathing grew shallow as the weight of Emily's words settled over him. Machines hummed steadily, indifferent to the choice forming behind his eyes. Outside the ICU room, agents and administrators waited each second, stretching thin with expectation. Inside, it was just the three of them, Emily, Morales, and a man whose anonymity had been his armor until it failed him on a rain-slick highway. My name doesn't matter, he said finally, voice rough. It never did. It does now, Emily replied. Because names anchor responsibility. He turned his head, slightly wincing as pain lanced through his chest. You're asking me to burn a network that doesn't forgive. Morales stepped closer. We're offering protection. The man snorted softly. Protection is temporary. Emily held his gaze. So is silence. A long pause followed. The kind that came when someone measured the cost of survival against the cost of living with themselves afterward. You saved me, he said, eyes never leaving hers. You didn't have to. I did, Emily said, simply. Because that's my job. No, he said. It's who you are. The words landed with quiet force. Start with the next move, Emily said. What's coming? He closed his eyes, then opened them again. A coordinated disruption, he said. Power. Transit. Emergency response delays. Nothing flashy. Just enough to create confusion. When Morales asked, the man shook his head. Windows, not dates. That's how they keep it flexible. Emily nodded. And Mercy General, he hesitated. Hospitals are pressure points, he admitted. Not targets. Stressors. Emily felt a chill run through her, not fear but recognition. You needed me alive because I recognized the pattern, she said. And they needed me gone because I would. The man's mouth twitched. They underestimated you. So did my hospital, Emily said. Outside, Director Hayes watched through the glass, her face pale. She understood that what had nearly broken Mercy General wasn't just ego or bad policy, but proximity to something far larger. Morales checked his watch. "We need to escalate," he said. Emily nodded. "Do it." The man's fingers tightened weakly around the sheet. "If I talk," he said again, quieter, "now there's no going back." Emily leaned in, her voice low and steady. "There never is," she said. "That's why it matters." He let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. "You really believe systems can change?" "I believe people can," Emily replied. "Systems follow." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once. "All right," he said. "I'll tell you everything I know." The effect was immediate. Morales stepped back, speaking rapidly into his radio. Agents moved with renewed urgency. Phones lit up across the hospital as information began flowing upward and outward, carried by secure channels to places far beyond Mercy General's walls. Emily stayed where she was. She watched as the man spoke, halting at first, then with growing clarity. Names, routes, dead drops disguised as maintenance yards and abandoned depots, timelines that overlapped like fault lines beneath a city. Each detail confirmed what Emily had suspected since the moment she'd felt the patient's chest rise unevenly under her hands. This wasn't chaos, it was design. Hours later, the ICU doors opened, and Emily stepped into the corridor. Morales followed, closing the door softly behind them. "He's in protective custody," Morales said. "He won't leave this building without an escort." Emily nodded. And Mercy General Morales hesitated. "It's now a site of interest. That won't play well," Emily said. "No," Morales agreed. "But it will play honestly." They walked together toward the administrative wing. Staff parted instinctively, their gazes lingering not with awe now, but with something closer to respect. In a conference room down the hall, Dr. Wallace sat across from legal counsel, his posture rigid. When Emily entered, the room stilled. "You wanted to see me?" Wallace asked, his voice controlled but strained. Emily closed the door behind her. "I did." The lawyers exchanged looks but said nothing. "You believed you were protecting the hospital," Emily said, standing across from him, "by enforcing protocol." Wallace nodded. "Order matters." "Yes," Emily said, "but so does discernment." She slid a tablet across the table. "This is what nearly passed through your ER last night without detection," she said. "And this is why silence is dangerous." Wallace stared at the screen color draining from his face. "You're saying I'm saying your need for control almost created a blind spot," Emily said. "And blind spots get people killed." The words hit harder than any accusation. Wallace looked up at her, something breaking through his defensiveness at last. "I didn't know." "No," Emily said gently. "You didn't ask." She turned to leave. "Emily," Wallace said, desperation threading his voice. "What happens to me?" Emily paused at the door. "That depends," she said, "on whether you learn from this." By evening, the hospital was buzzing with controlled chaos. Federal teams came and went. Systems were audited in real time. Policies that had stood unchallenged for decades were suddenly under scrutiny. Emily stood once more near the ER entrance, watching the sun dip low over the city. The rain had finally stopped. Pavement steamed as heat rose back into the air. Hayes joined her. "We've agreed to your oversight conditions," she said. "All of them." Emily nodded. "Good." And Emily Hayes added, "There's something else." Emily turned. "The board wants to issue a public statement," Hayes said. "Acknowledging wrongdoing. Naming you." Emily considered that. "Do it," she said. "But make sure it's not about me." Hayes frowned. "Then what should it be about?" Emily looked back toward the ER, where nurses moved with renewed confidence, where voices carried just a little more strength. "Make it about what happens when people are heard," Emily said. Night fell again over Mercy General, but this time there were no helicopters, no storms, no shouting voices demanding answers. Just a hospital learning painfully and publicly what accountability looked like. And somewhere deep within its walls, a truth had finally surfaced, one that could no longer be buried under protocol or pride. The official statement went live just after 9:00 p.m. Mercy General Hospital acknowledged serious failures in internal response culture, announced an independent federal review, and confirmed that leadership changes were under consideration. Emily Carter's name appeared only once, buried in the middle, stripped of titles, described simply as the clinician whose actions prevented loss of life. It was exactly how Emily wanted it. She stood in the quiet corridor outside the ICU, reading the statement on her phone as notifications exploded across social media. Reporters were already circling. Hayes had warned her they would try to get a comment. Emily had declined. Inside the ICU room, the patient slept again, this time under tighter security. 2 agents stood just beyond the glass, their presence subtle but unmistakable. The man had talked for hours until exhaustion finally overtook him. What he'd given them was enough to justify a national escalation, enough to make Mercy General a footnote in something much larger. Morales approached, lowering his voice. "Washington's moving fast," he said. "Assets are being repositioned. We've likely disrupted their timeline." Emily nodded. "Likely isn't enough." Morales studied her. "You want certainty." "I want prevention," Emily replied. Morales exhaled. "You sound like command." Emily's mouth twitched. "Old habits." Across the hall, a group of nurses gathered around a workstation, whispering as they watched a news clip replay footage of the helicopters landing the night before. Someone recognized the helipad lights. Someone else pointed at the angle of descent. "That's our roof," a nurse said softly. Emily watched them for a moment. Not pride, not vindication, something quieter. Permission. Hayes joined them, tablet tucked under her arm. "The board has accepted Dr. Wallace's resignation," she said. Emily closed her eyes briefly. "He didn't have to resign," he insisted, Hayes replied. "Said it was the only way to stop the hospital from pretending this was an anomaly." Emily considered that. "Then he learned something." Hayes nodded. "He requested to speak with you. One last time." Emily hesitated, then nodded. "All right." They found Wallace in a small office overlooking the parking lot. His white coat was gone. So was the rigid confidence that had once defined him. He looked older now, as if the last 24 hours had finally caught up. "Thank you for coming," he said as Emily entered. She remained standing. "You wanted to talk." Wallace swallowed. "I owe you an apology." Emily waited. "I confused authority with infallibility," he continued, "and I punished dissent because it threatened my control, not because it endangered patients." Emily studied him carefully. "Why now?" "Because Wallace said quietly when the helicopters landed, I realized something terrifying." "What?" "That the system I trusted would have failed without you," he said. "And that I would have defended that failure." Silence settled between them. Emily nodded once. "That's the most honest thing you've said." Wallace looked up at her. What happens to me? Emily thought of the nurses finding their voices, of the resident who had promised not to stay silent again, of the man in the ICU who had chosen to speak because someone had chosen to act. "That depends on what you do next," she said, "not what you were." She turned to leave. Emily, Wallace called after her. "I was wrong." She paused at the door. "Yes," she said, "you were." Outside, the hospital buzzed with controlled urgency. Federal teams rotated out. Local staff filled the gaps. The machine kept running, but its gears were grinding differently now, slower, more deliberate. Near midnight, Hayes found Emily on the roof. The helipad was empty, slick with rainwater reflecting city lights below. The wind was cool, carrying the distant sound of traffic. "You should go home," Hayes said gently. "At least rest." Emily stared out over the city. "I will," she said. "Soon." Hayes hesitated. "Washington asked if you'd consider returning." "Officially. Full authority." Emily smiled faintly. "They always do." And I told them the same thing I told you," Emily replied. "I'll stay long enough to make sure this doesn't revert the moment attention fades." Hayes nodded. "You're changing how this place breathes." Emily shook her head. "They're changing it. I'm just holding the door open." Below them, a lone janitor pushed a cart across the lobby, humming quietly. A nurse laughed softly at something a resident said. Life imperfect and resilient moved forward. Emily's phone buzzed. "Morales. They've made arrests," he said without preamble. 2 states, more pending." Emily closed her eyes. "Good." And Emily Morales added, "They want to debrief you in person. Tomorrow." She nodded. I'll be there. When she finally left the hospital, it was after midnight. The parking lot was nearly empty now, rain puddles drying under streetlights. She paused by the spot where she'd stood hours earlier, soaked, fired, dismissed. She looked at the doors. Then she walked past them. Because this time she was leaving by choice. Behind her, Mercy General stood illuminated against the dark, a building that had nearly broken itself by silencing the wrong voice. And ahead of her, the consequences of speaking up were still unfolding. But for the first time, Emily Carter felt something close to hope, not because justice had arrived loudly, but because it had finally been allowed to stay. The city woke slowly the next morning, unaware of how close it had come to a different kind of headline. Emily Carter stood at her apartment window watching early traffic crawl along rain-darkened streets. She hadn't slept much. Sleep came in fragments now, short alert, never fully surrendering. It was a habit she'd never quite unlearned. Her phone lay on the kitchen counter, silent for once. She poured coffee black and let the steam rise. For the first time in days, there were no alarms, no sirens, no voices demanding decisions in seconds. Just quiet. At 0800 sharp, she was back at Mercy General. Not as staff, not as command, as presence. The hospital felt different in daylight. Less dramatic, more exposed. Staff moved with purpose, but there was a subtle shift in posture, heads up, shoulders squared. Conversations didn't die when Emily passed anymore. They paused, then continued. That mattered. In the main conference room, Director Hayes convened the final briefing. Federal observers sat along one wall, hospital leadership along the other. Emily took a seat near the center, not at the head. This concludes the initial phase of the review, Hayes said. Findings will be released in stages. She glanced toward Emily. Dr. Carter. Emily, she corrected gently. Hayes nodded. Emily has agreed to remain on site as interim oversight advisor. Her role will be advisory, corrective, and independent. A murmur rippled through the room. One administrator raised a hand. How long will this oversight last? Emily answered, before Hayes could. As long as it needs to, she said. Or until you no longer need someone watching the watchers. No one laughed. After the meeting, Emily walked the hospital one last time before heading to Washington. She stopped by the ICU. The patient, now no longer anonymous in federal files but still anonymous to the hospital, was awake. He looked better, stronger, guarded. They moved fast, he said when he saw her. Too fast for them to recover cleanly. That was the goal, Emily replied. He studied her. You didn't have to stay. Yes, she said. I did. He nodded slowly. You're not like the others. Emily tilted her head. Neither are you anymore. When she left the room, Morales was waiting in the corridor. Car's ready, he said. Washington wants answers, and they don't like waiting. Emily glanced back once more at the ICU doors. They'll get them, she said. Just not the ones they expect. The drive to the airfield was quiet. No sirens, no escorts, just a black sedan moving through ordinary traffic. Morales broke the silence. You know this doesn't end here. Emily looked out the window. It never does. They'll want you back. Full time. Authority. Resources. She smiled faintly. They always do. And I'll say the same thing I always say, Emily replied. Fix the system. Don't replace it with me. The plane lifted off under clear skies. From above, the city looked calm, ordered, deceptively simple. Mercy General became a cluster of lights, then a dot, then nothing at all. 3 weeks later, the headlines changed. Not because of helicopters, because of policy. Hospitals across the state announced revisions, anonymous reporting protections. Mandatory peer challenge protocols documented override pathways that protected clinicians who acted in good faith. Mercy General became a case study, not of failure, of correction. Dr. Wallace accepted a teaching role at a smaller institution. No authority, no grand titles, just classrooms and students and time to reflect. He never spoke publicly about Emily Carter, but he changed how he taught. That mattered too. Emily returned once more, briefly, quietly. No cameras, no announcements. She stood in the ER during a routine shift when a nurse spoke up, challenging an order calmly, clearly. The attending listened, adjusted. Good catch, he said. Emily didn't intervene. She left an hour later without saying goodbye, because she didn't need to. The rain never came back that night, just a steady breeze through open hospital doors carrying in the sounds of a city moving forward, imperfect but alive. And somewhere between silence and action, a line had finally been drawn, not by helicopters, not by authority, but by someone who refused to look away when it mattered. Sometimes the most dangerous failures don't happen in chaos, they happen in silence. When people are trained to obey without question to protect hierarchy instead of truth, small errors grow into irreversible harm. Real strength isn't loud. It doesn't demand recognition or force compliance. It shows up quietly, does the right thing, and accepts the cost when it matters most. Emily Carter wasn't a hero because of her past or the helicopters that came looking for her. She was a hero because she chose responsibility over comfort, integrity over approval, and courage over silence. And when one person does that, systems can change slowly, painfully, but permanently. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever seen someone speak up when it would have been easier to stay quiet? And if you value stories that explore justice, courage, and the power of doing what's right, don't forget to subscribe.